Back in 2013, a 66-year-old hiker named Geraldine Largay, aka Gerry, visited the Appalachian Trail. This was a trip that she had been preparing for months in advance, so as you would expect, she was extremely excited. Geraldine had been hiking for years and needed a new challenge, that of course being the Appalachian Trail. Amongst her friends and family, she earned herself the nickname Inchworm. Now, in case you don't know, traversing the entire Appalachian Trail in one go can take upwards of 6 months. It's well over 2,000 miles and goes through over a dozen cities. And most people don't even have the physical or mental fortitude to complete the entire trail in one attempt. Most of the people that set out on this challenge don't actually finish. In Geraldine's corner was her loving husband, George. Now, George wanted nothing to do with the actual hike itself, but he understood just how passionate his wife was about hiking and just how badly she wanted to complete this challenge. So instead of actually hiking the trail alongside Geraldine, George would frequently visit her at certain points to bring her fresh supplies and just check in with her. These check-ins were done on an almost daily basis. George was quoted saying, "Hiking the Appalachian Trail and sleeping in tents and wearing the same stuff for days in the rain, not on my bucket list. But she needed to be supported on the hike because she had limits on what she could carry. So I simply had to say, okay, suck it up. What's 6 months in the grand scheme of things?" In addition to George, there was another person who wanted to be involved in the hike. Her name was Jane Lee. Instead of simply checking in on Geraldine like George, Jane was actually going to be by her side during the entire journey. Or at least that was the plan. So fast forward to mid-April, the three visited Harper's Ferry in West Virginia to tackle the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine and Jane set out on their journey with George ready to assist them along the way. The first few days were a breeze for Geraldine and Jane. They were all smiles, and George was simply happy to see that they were enjoying themselves. The duo continued and met a lot of other hikers along the way. When Geraldine told these other hikers that she planned to cross the entire trail, they were shocked. Most would have doubted the abilities of a younger physically fit person when it came to hiking the entire trail. So just imagine what they thought about a 66-year-old attempting it. One day, Jane received an unexpected call with some bad news. An emergency had occurred back home. Her daughter had an accident which resulted in her ankle being fractured. Jane apologized to Geraldine and said that she needed to get back home to take care of her daughter. Geraldine obviously said that's totally fine and urged her to rush back home as soon as possible. By this point, the two had covered about half of the trail already, and Geraldine didn't see the purpose of quitting, so she decided to continue the hike solo. While Jane's absence didn't bother Geraldine, it did concern George. He didn't like that his wife was all alone out there in the wilderness, but Geraldine assured him that she would be fine and there were many other hikers out there that she could ask for help if it was necessary. By the time July rolled around, Geraldine was headed into the more rugged part of the hike, and according to many hikers, if you stray from a certain path by even 5 or so feet, you could get very lost at this point. There's even this warning sign telling you to have at the very least 10 days worth of supplies before you even think of continuing the journey. The hike after this sign would have no openings to restock for about 100 miles. So Geraldine and George agreed to meet at the Route 27 crossing for more supplies before Geraldine continued. On the path to her husband, Geraldine rested at a lodge where she came into contact with several other hikers. They sat down and enjoyed each other's company, and this photo of Geraldine was captured. Little did everyone know that this photo would be the last one taken of her before she went missing. George was waiting for his wife the very next day, July 23rd, at Route 27, but Geraldine never showed up. At first, he didn't think much of this and just waited outside his car a while longer. But then it became clear to George that something bad had happened. He tried to contact Geraldine by phone, but these attempts failed as George expected. So he opted to call authorities, who then organized a search party. Days quickly turned into weeks and weeks into months. The search party grew and involved dogs and search helicopters, but no matter what resources were used, nobody could locate Geraldine. People were beginning to suspect that perhaps Geraldine had actually been murdered, but over 2 years later, the public would finally get their answer as to what had happened to her. It was October 2015 when a forester employed by the US Navy named Kevin Adam made a gruesome discovery while researching an area on the Appalachian Trail. During his exploration, he found what looked to be an abandoned campsite. The tent was flattened and nearby was a backpack. Kevin crept closer to the tent and found a zipped up sleeping bag with some lumps underneath. He unzipped it and saw a human skull. Now, Kevin had heard of Geraldine going missing in 2013, so he instantly asked himself, is this Geraldine? He stated that this campsite was hidden pretty well. It would be almost impossible to find without prior knowledge of its location. And right above it were layers and layers of thick tree branches, which would have made it impossible for helicopters to find as well. An interesting detail are the items that Kevin found, or rather lack thereof. Despite being an experienced hiker, Geraldine didn't carry certain items that one might expect, such as a fire starter, whistle, flare, GPS unit, etc. On the trees nearby, there were even signs that Geraldine had attempted to start a fire by hand. And depending on the source, some said that she didn't even have a compass, but other sources stated that she did have one, however she didn't know how to use it. Regardless, it was all very strange. It looked almost as if Geraldine wasn't really prepared to tackle the 2,000+ mile trail at all. Amongst the items was Geraldine's mossy notebook. Inside was a page titled, "George, please read, XOXO." One entry written on August 18th, 2013 said the following: "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. Please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them." Other pages inside showed that Geraldine was keeping track of what day it was since she had gotten lost. It was also revealed that Geraldine had attempted to text George when she went missing. On July 23rd, 2013, there was a text that failed to send that said, "In some trouble, got off trail to go to the bathroom, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road, XOX." Geraldine went on to try and send this text nearly a dozen times that day, all of which failed. On the 24th, Geraldine tried to text George once more, this time at a higher elevation, hoping that there would be a signal. "Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do, please. XOX." It was determined that Geraldine had died from a mixture of starvation and environmental exposure. Her husband George passed away in September of 2019 as a result of pancreatic cancer. This next entry takes us back to the 50s and 70s with the formation of a cult by a man named Jim Jones. In 1955, Jim was residing in the state of Indiana, and that's where he formed a group that later became known as the People's Temple. Ever since he was a child, Jim was sent down a religious road, which influenced him into becoming a Christian minister. Now, Jim was a very charismatic man, which was perfect since he later became obsessed with Pentecostalism. And if you don't know, those are basically those super passionate preacher guys. You have probably seen a video at some point of someone grabbing a disabled person that can't walk, for example, speak in some tongues, and then miraculously the person can walk again. That's what Jim Jones did. In fact, there was one occasion during a gathering where Jim demonstrated this ability. It quite literally unfolded the exact same way I described. He gave a disabled woman the ability to walk again. However, this woman, unbeknownst to everyone else, was actually hired just for this act. But many people who attended the event and witnessed what Jim did were sort of convinced that he had some special God-given power. And again, it didn't help that this guy was very, very charismatic. There were many women who also supported Jim that would later go on to say that he was very handsome, and that sort of played a role in them being influenced by him. So all of this in combination created a great opportunity for Jim Jones to manipulate people. Sometime in the 60s, Jim transported the People's Temple over to San Francisco, California. And it's in the 60s where rumors that Jim is rather aggressive and had the tendency to lash out at his followers started coming out. But Jim's followers didn't see anything wrong with this. They literally idolized the man. He could do no wrong in their eyes. Many even handed all of their assets and cash over to Jim and his organization. So as the years went by and the People's Temple became more well known, onlookers wanted to find out a bit more. And it was clear to many from the outside looking in that Jim was not only abusing his power, but he was also abusing and manipulating his people. Jim started getting an immense amount of backlash from the public, and it became clear to him that he needed to leave the area. There were serious allegations that Jim was conducting criminal activities within his group. So as this topic got more and more popular amongst media outlets, he made the decision to construct a sort of community in Guyana, which is located in South America, and many of his US followers wanted to join him there. He elaborated and stated that this community he was building would be free from the oppression that he and his followers were facing in the US. At this point, authorities were on the brink of doing a large-scale investigation into the practices of the People's Temple and finding out just what exactly Jim Jones was doing. It took about a year of discussion between the government of Guyana and Jim before they agreed to let him create a settlement in their country. In the mid-1970s, Jim was able to leave the US for a northwestern part of Guyana and lease this piece of land that was nearly 4,000 acres. And this location was pretty bad for living, as you would expect. It was in a jungle and the overall conditions just didn't seem livable. But Jim Jones guaranteed that he was going to create a utopia for his followers, and those who didn't have faith in him were doubting God. Or him. He literally started to refer to himself as a godly figure. But instead of creating a community for his people to thrive in, the over 900 residents of Jim's settlement, which would later become known as Jonestown, would die. And before we continue, I'd like to shift gears and examine a family of 5, the Parks. It consisted of Gerald Parks, his wife Patricia, and their 3 children. In the 60s, they moved to California in order to stick by the side of Jim Jones. And as we have already discussed, Jim later moved the People's Temple over to Guyana in the 70s. Gerald and his family were amongst those that moved to Guyana with Jim. And we'll get back to this family in a bit since they are pretty important when it comes to this story. In 1978, a man named Leo Ryan, who was a politician, caught wind of those allegations that the People's Temple was facing. He did some more research and realized that the leader, Jim Jones, was actually moving the group to South America. Obviously, this sort of confused Leo, and he wanted to investigate because on the surface, it seemed like Jim was really abusing his followers and relocating was simply his strategy to not be investigated or caught. Leo soon learned that there were claims that those who followed Jim to Guyana were suffering from things such as group beatings, forced labor, and much more. It was also rumored that Jim sort of had an admiration towards some famous dictators in history, which, needless to say, is worrisome. In the fall of 1978, Leo Ryan finally made the trip down to Guyana to visit Jonestown, and by his side was a camera crew and several journalists to document the entire journey. Leo requested that some other officials join him on his investigation, however, everyone he asked declined. So on November 14th, Leo touched down in the capital of Guyana, which is Georgetown, 150 miles from Jonestown. And at first, Jim did not allow for Leo and his group to step foot in Jonestown. It took several days of discussion and compromising before Leo was finally allowed in. And immediately upon crossing into Jonestown, he saw dozens of people greeting him and they all seemed happy. And while the actual facilities didn't quite look like a quote-unquote utopia, it was thriving, and again, people genuinely seemed very happy. Jim provided Leo and the group with a tour of the settlement, and things looked to be in a properly organized array. There were hundreds of people there, and Leo took his time interviewing as many of them as possible. Every single person had nothing but good things to say about Jim and their living conditions. Leo literally said that from what he can see and hear, it seemed like Jonestown was the best thing to ever happen for some of these people. But right as Leo was about to convince himself that Jim was innocent, he got a tap on the shoulder. One of the journalists that joined Leo on this trip handed him a note. This journalist said that one of the residents gave it to him. When Leo unfolded it and read it, it said, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." One of Jim's more loyal followers noticed that Leo seemed rather angsty all of a sudden and noticed the note. He immediately rushed to tell Jim that Leo had figured them out. All of the laughter and the smiles was just a facade. In reality, the people were suffering and those that wanted to leave were not allowed to. In fact, during the 7 to 8 months in which the Parks lived in Jonestown, Gerald made it very clear that he did not like the place. One resident that Gerald confided in had snitched on him to Jim, and this resulted in several members ganging up on Gerald one night. But he stayed resilient and held on to hope that he and his family would survive. Both he and his daughters have shared a lot of detailed information about their stay in Jonestown, and it's quite literally a nightmare. Gerald's two daughters, Brenda and Tracy, shared that they basically worked all day and the food they were given was primarily made up of rice. There was no nutritional value at all. The people were given the bare minimum. So on November 18th, the day after Leo received the note, Gerald's mother had actually walked up to Leo and whispered to him that they hated it there and they needed his help to escape. And Leo told her not to worry and that he would make sure to take with him those who wanted to leave. That was his entire goal with this trip in the first place. Leo was also told that upon their arrival, the residents of Jonestown had all of their personal belongings, including their passports, taken from them. So by around 3 p.m. that day, Leo had gathered a decently sized group of people who wanted to leave Jonestown. Amongst those were the Parks. As you would expect, Jim was heated, but he didn't allow it to show on the surface. He simply waved them off and said, "Okay, you can leave." Leo eagerly got all the defectors onto a truck and drove off to an airstrip where two aircrafts awaited them. And those who remained loyal to Jim Jones just berated those defectors and called them a bunch of terrible names. They said things like, "You're turning your back on God and you're leaving this amazing place." It took nearly 2 hours to traverse through the jungle and arrive at the airstrip. But when they arrived, those planes that should have been waiting were missing. Another 20 or so minutes had passed before they finally arrived and could start boarding people. For whatever reason, the Parks family was split up between the two planes. Gerald, his mother, and Patricia went on one plane, while the three children had to board the other. And right as they were getting on the plane, Gerald Parks heard this humming sound getting closer and closer. It sort of sounded like a truck engine. Then Gerald saw it. A truck carrying Jim Jones's followers came into view from the trees. At first, Gerald simply thought that these were more people who decided that they don't want to stay in Guyana. But then he realized these men were holding guns. As soon as they were close enough, they opened fire. At that exact same time, people within the group of defectors had also opened fire. Jim Jones had sent several of his followers to join the defectors and pretend that they were leaving as well. Amongst those that died on the airstrip were Patricia Parks, Leo Ryan, and at least 4 other people. Eventually, the People's Temple members did leave the strip. Gerald's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan because he thought that those men were going to return and either finish the job or drag them back to Jonestown. So he got his daughters, Tracy and Brenda, as well as the other children, and told them to run off into the jungle to stay hidden. But Gerald told them to not stray too far as it's easy to get lost in there. He simply wanted the kids to roam around the edge in cover and wait for him to call them back once he was sure it was safe. Tracy was later quoted saying that she was so scared and filled with adrenaline that it felt like she was flying when she ran off the strip and into the jungle. And once she got there, all she could do was cry as she had just witnessed the death of her own mother. After a couple of hours had passed, Gerald went over to the jungle and called out for Tracy and Brenda, but no one showed up or responded to him. Gerald started to get anxious and ventured deeper into the wilderness, calling out for his kids, but still no sign of them. Turned out that Tracy and Brenda had just continued running deeper and deeper into the jungle because of all the adrenaline running through them. For all Gerald knew, Jim's goons had captured the kids. However, this was not the case, and while they were not captured, Tracy's health was declining. She had recently caught a fever, which really worried her older sister, Brenda. Brenda happened to be the oldest of the group of kids, so she took it upon herself to sort of be a leader for them. She knew that they were still in danger, so she suggested that they continue to seek a better place to hide. By the third day in the jungle, everyone's morale was defeated. Tracy told her sister that she didn't want to go on any longer. She was just too exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. Her mind sort of felt at ease at the thought of simply giving up. And being that Brenda was also exhausted, she too started to think maybe all of this effort really was futile. But then she heard what sounded like music getting closer. Brenda jolted back to life and went to hide. She saw several men armed with guns making their way through the trees. At that moment, Brenda came to terms that it was probably over and these men were going to take her back to Jim. Little did she know that these men were actually there to save her and those other kids. After Gerald failed at locating the kids, he and the other adults, as well as his son Dale, were flown back to the US on one of those planes. The pilot contacted a US ambassador and informed him about the incident that had just unfolded on the airstrip. So then the US got into contact with the government of Guyana and they sent out several soldiers in search of the children in the jungle. Additionally, there was another group of soldiers sent to Jonestown. And this is where they made a crazy discovery. Over 900 people were lying down dead. After just a brief sweep of the area, it became clear that this was a mass. What had happened was back when Jim Jones's men returned after attacking the airstrip, they told Jim that some of the people there survived. This led Jim to conclude that the US was going to learn of his crimes and attack Jonestown. Jim called all of his followers and said that the US government was going to come stomping in very soon to massacre them all. Jim then stated that instead they would put their lives in their own hands. Every single member had been given a cup of Kool-Aid that was mixed with cyanide. For those that did not want to use this method, soldiers were standing by ready to assist them. As for Jim Jones himself, he died as a result of a gunshot wound. And something that I haven't mentioned yet is Jim held these gatherings in Jonestown called White Nights. These meetings occurred randomly, sometimes once a week. During them, Jim had his followers consume juice or some sort of fruit drink, a drink such as Kool-Aid. This was done to test just how devout his people were because at any given meeting, it was possible that those drinks contained something lethal. Jim Jones wanted to know that his people were willing to die for him and do whatever he requested. Obviously, nobody was told ahead of time if a certain week's meeting was going to contain the bad drink, but they all knew eventually it was going to happen. In fact, I'm sure that there were people who thought that the Kool-Aid they drank on the 18th was yet again just another test, because each of those White Night meetings, Jim Jones made it seem like it was going to be the real thing. Gerald and his family were some of the very limited few that survived Jonestown, and I'm sure most of the survivors struggled badly when trying to reintegrate into normal society. But Brenda herself has spoken out on several occasions about the terrible PTSD she had developed. She passed away in 2013 due to issues with her health. Gerald Parks passed away from kidney failure in November of 2022. Both Dale and Tracy are the last surviving members of the Parks family who lived in Jonestown.